Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to our next lecture in Test and Measurements, Chapter 10 on a neuropsych assessment. Okay, so as usual, let me just pull up my screen here and let us begin. All right, folks, neuropsychological assessment. Um, Well, quite an interesting area in test and measurements, and for those in clinical psychology. For those of you pursuing a career in mental health treatment, mental health care, um, you need to be familiar with this stuff. Yeah. Even if you're not interested in pursuing neuropsychology, you're as a mental health practitioner. You're going to encounter these materials, okay, and need to be familiar with what they are, what they say, how you can use the information, and so on. All righty. And certainly, if you're going to be a clinical psychologist providing treatment, you invariably will probably do some of these tests, even though you're not necessarily a neuropsychologist, right? You might need to do some of these tests in order to make a neuropsychology referral to a neuropsychologist, yeah, or possibly a neurological referral to a MD, a neurologist. Alrighty, so let's start off by talking about what neuropsychological assessment is. Okay. We'll pass this. We'll talk about this maybe some other time. All right. So neuropsychology, as you probably heard before, and then as you can probably infer, is the study of brain behavior relationships. All righty. So if what basically neuropsychology is looking at the relationship of different brain functions, brain regions, how they interact, and then how those brain a particular region or function and their interaction, how they manifest themselves in terms of behavior, yeah, particularly test behavior. With the idea that the testing behavior will tell us something about the person's behavior in general, in life, in work, and social functioning, and so on. Yeah, that's the whole idea. Yeah, we don't want to just see the test behavior, but the test behavior in terms of what we can infer or generalize about their overall functioning. All righty. Now, what are some of the reasons why you may encounter a neuropsychological assessment? Either get a question, a referral to do this kind of testing, or this kind of information may come across your desk. Alrighty. Well, neuropsych assessments are usually done for one of these major reasons. Okay. One is for diagnostic purposes, very common. Yeah. So it may be to determine whether someone is suffering from a dementia, for example, yeah, or maybe for differential diagnosis to distinguish between, let's say, the early onset of Alzheimer's, or whether the person is demonstrating cognitive deficits as a result of depression. Alrighty. Um, Also, it may be used to determine whether a child's attentional deficits are within the normal range or whether they are in the range that's more commonly associated with ADHD. Alrighty. Other reasons neuropsych assessment may be done is that even in the event that you know someone's diagnosis, it may be still helpful for a physician, for a therapist to understand the kinds of the patient's strengths and weaknesses, yeah, cognitive strengths and weaknesses. Even though one may know the diagnosis, one may not know, people within a particular diagnostic category can really vary a lot in terms of their strengths and weaknesses in terms of cognitive functioning. Alrighty, and that's where neuropsych assessment can give you very specific data on what those strengths and weaknesses may be. It is sometimes used for vocational treatment planning. Yeah, so even though psychologists or may know their client's diagnosis, what generally their strengths and weaknesses are. Sometimes having this data allows them to really determine a very specific treatment plan. Yeah, in terms of what things to do, maybe place things in a hierarchy in terms of what's more important to focus in on and otherwise. Yeah. And certainly related to this, this may be also applied to vocational training, yeah, workplace training. Alrighty, or someone's having problems in the workplace. Yeah, again, what will help them? How can you kind of remedy their problems at work? Maybe they're having problems with attention or concentration or planning and organizing. So, what exactly is the problem? What will help them get through maybe a rough patch in terms of work? Okay. And finally, the other area that forensic neuropsychological assessment is used is in the forensic setting, very commonly. Yeah, I don't know what the percentage is, but it's kind of close to half the time a neuropsych assessment will be involved. Anywhere between a third to half the time, you're going to see this kind of data come up in forensic um, issues. Certainly in the civil sector, yeah, if someone is suing somebody, let's just say can of paint fell on their head when they were at Walmart, and now they're saying, they can't concentrate at work, and now they're suing Walmart. Neuropsychological assessment goes hand in hand with adjudicating that kind of matter. Yeah. So in civil actions, more likely than not, you're going to run into neuropsych assessment. In criminal, you may not. Yeah. So, for example, the insanity plea, if someone's found not fit to stay in trial, neuropsych assessment may come into play, and to kind of help adjudicate those criminal legal matters. Okay, some terms to be kind of familiar with and are neurological damage, brain damage, and organicity. Okay, now neurological damage is kind of the big umbrella. Okay, that just refers to any kind of problem with a brain functioning. Okay, when you hear the term brain damage, though, that term is usually limited to when there's actual anatomical destruction. Okay, so maybe because of a car accident, certain part of the brain on a CAT scan or MRI is clearly damaged, or there's the presence of a tumor. Yeah, so some kind of actual physical damage. That's what the term brain damage is usually meant to indicate. Okay, specific physical damage. Okay. Organicity, though, is often associated with, and it very well may be related to actual physical brain damage, but as a technical matter, really just essentially refers to functional consequences which may attend anatomical destruction. So let's just say someone has, is experiencing a tumor in their frontal lobe. Okay. The functional consequence may be difficulty in impulse control or organizing their day-to-day routine, right? So when they're having poor difficulty with impulse control, right, they're kind of acting out or aggressively whenever they get frustrated where they never did before prior to the car accident. That is what's referred to as organicity, yeah, the poor impulse control. Or if they're having difficulty like getting to the bus stop on time, ever since that car accident, right? They're having difficulty getting to work on time, and so on. That is organicity, it's a functional consequence of the anatomical destruction or damage. Okay. Um, as an aside, the reality is that these terms are often used interchangeably. Okay, but these are the distinctions that are kind of important to keep in mind. All righty. We're going to be talking about two approaches to administering neuropsychological tests. The first is the fixed battery approach. Okay. Now, in the fixed battery approach, what that is, and there are two major ones. You have the Luria, Nebraska, and the Halstead Rayton. Now, in each battery, right, those are two separate batteries. In each battery, they're basically a collection of several, anywhere between about 10 to 12 different separate neuropsychological tests that are grouped together into this one battery or collection of tests. And they're administered, with the idea that you do the complete battery, you go through all the tests and usually in a specific sequence. All righty. Now, the first of the two is the older of the two. and it's the Lurie, Nebraska neuropsychological battery. Alrighty. Now, its structure is that it provides, once you administer all the tests in a particular sequence, it provides clinical scales, yeah, so that you can see exactly what the nature of the damage may be. Yeah, is it expressive speech, memory, attention, planning, so on. By structure, it also provides localization scales. Yeah, so you can determine whether it's more the left or right hemisphere, right? The frontal lobes, temporal lobes, occipital, and so on. So it's that idea that you can kind of locate exactly where damage may be. Okay, and it's more of a verbally based battery. So if the problem isn't so much things such as finding your way back home, you have visual spatial stuff like, being able to use a map. But it's more stuff like, reading the newspaper and having a harder time remembering what you just read, um, you know, and so on, reading comprehension difficulties. The Luria is usually a better choice than the Halstead Rayton. Okay. Now, in terms of its the research behind it, there's a lot of research to support its validity. Yeah, in particular, its discriminative function, its ability to determine who's suffering from brain pathology versus who isn't. All right. It's some of its weaknesses. It may be less sensitive to mild impairment. Yeah, it's usually better suited when someone's clearly suffering from moderate to severe uh, uh, brain problems. Okay. In terms of its localization scales, the research has been kind of mixed in terms of how good it's able to determine the exact location of brain difficulty, and it's been also mixed in terms of its ability to determine memory problems. Okay, but it's still relatively popular because it's really easy to administer. Yeah, the kit can be carried in a box, right? Kind of about maybe a few 3 feet wide and 2 feet in length, and maybe about close to almost a foot in height. Yeah, so it's an easy, handy kit. Now that might sound like a kind of a trite um, uh, characteristic or advantage, but it isn't actually, because a lot of the time neuropsychologists have to go to hospitals or nursing homes. So in other words, they have to go to the patient and not the patient coming to their handy dandy office. So it becomes really handy dandy to bring a kit with you that you can carry. All righty, so that's why the Lurie is sometimes still used by people. And here are a number of the tests that are make up the Luria, the test for motor coordination, rhythm perception, tactile, yeah, sense perception. So you can see it's getting at a number of sensory perceptual functions. Expressive speech, here's a lot of the verbal stuff we spoke about, writing, reading, math ability, and so on. Yeah, so we had got about 11 subtests there. Now with the Halstead Rayton, okay, this is another battery. This is a newer one. It's the one you're more likely to encounter. Um, it's more popularly used. Its structure is that it's good for determining the presence of brain pathology, yeah, presence or absence. It also is more sensitive to variations in brain functioning. So from the sensitive to the more to the slight to the more severe cases, and it's a little better with performance-based tasks. Yeah, that visual spatial kind of stuff. All right. Interesting enough, the Halstead Rayton, reason why it's really good for performance visual spatial stuff, it actually was invented or put together by psychologists who are actually interested in trying to develop a biological uh, intelligence test. Yeah, one less based on verbal abilities, but more based on inherent visual spatial kind of abilities. Yeah, often referred to as performance abilities. Um, but it didn't work out so well as an IQ test. But this happens sometimes with science. Although scientists may intend to create one thing, they end up with something else that is handy for another purpose. And that's the case with the Halstead Rayton. Not a test of biological intelligence, but a good neuropsychological battery. It has a great discriminative function, just like the Luria, with a TP for not toilet paper, but true positive, with a true positive hit percentage of 80%, 80% accuracy. Alrighty. Its weakness, it does take a long time to administer because unlike the Luria, you usually have to, it's usually, there are a lot of big pieces to the test. Um, Literally, it's not like a paper book test like the IQ test. Actually, you can carry in a suitcase or carry in a small box. Same thing with the Luria. Not so much the Halstead Rayton. Yeah, Halstead Rayton actually includes a number of items, test items, which when you collect them, all the items of all the different individual tests that make up the Halstead Rayton, you got a pretty bulky. You can't carry that with you. It's something you're going to have in your office. Okay. Um, but its strength is that it's a good general indicator of brain pathology, yeah, brain problems. Also, it takes because of the number of tests and all the pieces, large pieces involved, it does take some time to administer. It's not uncommon that for someone who's suffering from, let's just say, moderate dementia, it may take you a few to several office visits to administer the Halstead Rayton. So here are all the tests to make up the Halstead Rayton. Very similar. Yeah, you can see a tactile test. Um, there's a seashore rhythm. Seashore meaning it's excuse me. It's a auditory test where a person hears different rhythm patterns, and then they have to repeat those rhythm patterns either by hitting their hand or on the table, tapping their hand on the table, or so on. Yeah. There's a finger tapping test, which we'll look at later. A grip strength test, which we'll look at later. And other classic tests in neuropsych, like trail making, and so on. Yeah, so you can see much less of the reading, writing stuff as we saw with the Luria. We'll look at this stuff maybe a little later. Okay, now the flexible battery approach is, unlike the battery, we don't have a set series of 10 or 12 tests to administer. Okay, it's what's done in a flexible battery is, as the term kind of connotes, the neuropsychologist or psychologist has a flexible approach to determining what tests and in what order they'll administer the test to the client. And it will be guided by the referral question. Yeah. So if the referral question is asking about attention, then the examiner will focus on a whole bunch of attentional tests. Yeah. So instead of one or two attentional tests from the Luria or Halstead Rayton, the psychologist may administer several attention tests. You have to be very focused on the specific referral question. Alrighty. And if he or she suspects there's other stuff going on, they may administer some other tests as well. Yeah. So it's very much a referral guided assessment. Okay, it's tailored to that question. Okay, which allows for more detailed description of the particular issue of concern. Alrighty, there's some pros and cons with the battery versus the flexible approach. When we meet face to face, we'll discuss that. Yeah, we'll probably discuss that. Now, from this point on with the lecture, what we're going to be doing is looking at various individual tests and approaches in neuropsych testing. Okay, a lot of these individual tests, again, in the flexible approach, can be combined to address a specific referral question. Also, a lot of these tests were part and parcel of the previous batteries that we just discussed. All right, the first, the mental status exam. Okay, what is a mental status exam? What it is essentially, there are a couple versions of this test, but it's essentially a series of anywhere between 10 to 12 questions that you sequentially, right, you in a very structured, standardized manner, ask an examinee. and it takes about 5 to 10 minutes to administer. It's kind of a quick and dirty measure of a lot of functions, but very good, very helpful in terms of one, first identifying a potential problem, and then related to that, um, coming up with if it need be, a good testing referral question. Alrighty. So, um, so because it's kind of quick and dirty, it's very good at giving you a general picture of the patient's cognitive functioning, but it's not meant to be take the place of neuropsych testing, but it can determine whether you need to do neuropsych testing and what areas may uh, be particularly necessary for testing. Okay. Uh, um, probably the most common one is the mini mental state exam, MMSE. Again, there's a set series of questions you can ask the examinee very quickly that tests things such as orientation. Now, orientation refers to the person's appreciation of time, place, and person. Yeah, and time meaning like what year it is, what month, what day of the week, what time, and so on. Alrighty, and people vary on that. Yeah, some know all of that. Many of us do. If you're suffering from some degree of brain damage, some of that might be impaired. Yeah, you may have difficulty knowing what year it is. You might mistakenly say 2019 or 2016, or the month. Yeah, even though we're in October, someone might slip into saying September and November, and so on. Okay, and that goes for the other time indicators. Okay, orientation to place is like with time, uh, appreciation of where you're located. Yeah, country, state, city, and particular setting, like location, university, hospital, or what have you. And finally, orientation to person relates to your appreciation of who you are. Can you identify yourself as who you are? Okay. As a general matter, orientation, time, place, and person is also referred to orientation times 3. So if you see that in a medical chart, a psychiatric chart, that's what it's referring to. Okay. So it's simply asking the person things such as, what year, what month, what day of the week is this, what time, and so on. Yeah. And similarly with place and person. As a rough rule of thumb, when someone is suffering from some kind of psychiatric condition and or specific neurological condition, yeah, if impairment occurs, it will usually first show in terms of orientation by time, yeah, then orientation by place, and last, but certainly not least, orientation to person. Okay, that's usually the last thing to go with someone who's suffering from really severe brain pathology. Yeah, most people might have some problems who are suffering from brain pathology with time. In worst cases, they might even have difficulty knowing where they are. Yeah, and again, it depends on what they don't know, right? If you don't know what building you're in, okay, depends, right? If you don't know whether you're in a university or hospital, that's not so great. If you don't know what state you're in, what city, and then what state, and then even what country, you know, yeah, the more obvious the question, the clearer, more apparent, and if you're having difficulty with that, the greater the pathology. All right. And finally, as I mentioned, most even people are suffering a lot of difficulties with time or place orientation. They'll still know who they are, right? They still can say, I'm John Smith. But man, if they're having difficulty with that, like they can't remember, or they say they're Jesus Christ or something, yeah, that's a very severe problem. Okay. And it has other questions regarding memory. There's an item where the examiner mentions 3 items. Offhand, I think it's watch, cat, and something else. I don't remember the 3 items. And then you ask the person to repeat them right after you say it. And then you ask them to repeat what those 3 items were a few minutes later. Okay. There's a test on mental control, and it's very simply a task where you ask them to spell the word world, like planet, right? Our world, backwards. Alrighty, good test of mental control. Can they take information and kind of work with it? Yeah. Uh, Measure concentration as well. Visual constructive skills, right? You might ask them to draw an object like a clock, and so on. And then multiple step commands, right? So you might, in the MMSC, you ask them to read something and then to, take the piece of paper and place it somewhere. Okay. So again, rough and dirty kind of way to assess someone's overall functioning and specific areas, not to take the place of neuropsych testing, but to allow you to determine whether you need to refer the person for testing and what your referral question may be. Okay, another part of neuropsych testing, certainly, almost, it goes, it's very frequently, these will go almost hand in hand, is IQ testing as well, like the WACE. Yeah, so that you can get an overall sense of IQ functioning, verbal functioning, and performance functioning, as well as all the information, excuse me, as well as all the information you can get from the subtests that we spoke about in the previous chapter. Yeah. Now, in addition to an ability test, yeah, you have an achievement test, okay? And the one that's most common is a wide range achievement test, yeah. Otherwise affectionately referred to as the RAT. It's currently in its third version, and it has tests for reading, spelling, and arithmetic. So aside from a specific overall ability and specific cognitive functions, you really get a sense of the person's functioning with specific academic abilities. It's particularly relevant if you got, let's say, a school referral, which is a very common neuropsych assessment. Yeah, if the question is whether the individual is suffering difficulties with, say, if there's a suspected learning disability, where that disability may lie, if there's suspected dyslexia, or just other academic problems. Okay. Now, in the determination of learning disability, okay, or sneezing ability, learning disability, is if there's a wide disparity between verbal and perceptual motor abilities. Yeah, if there's statistically significant difference between the two. The other one is, or the other criterion is whether they are performing about 2 standard deviations below their expected grade level. Okay, it often translates to if they're a 4th grader, but they're performing at the 2nd grade level on, let's say, reading or spelling or math. Yeah. Okay. So that's ability and achievement. Very common components of a neuropsych assessment. But again, it depends on the referral question. If it's a kid coming in because of suspected learning disability, ADHD, certainly this would come into play. You'd want to determine whether the child is suffering from an attentional deficit disorder, or if they're having a learning disability, and the anxiety and the emotional stuff is kind of a consequence of that, or maybe a consequence of that. Okay, let me stop here for a moment. Okay, folks, welcome back, and let me call up my screen again. Well, here we go. Alrighty then. Moving right along. The other bunch of tests, individual tests, you may administer as a neuropsychologist are tests of attention and concentration. Okay, so the difference between the two is attention refers to your ability to kind of focus or connect or take in information automatically, right? That kind of like the scanner on your computer, right? That, or on your phone, that ability to immediately focus and take in sensory information. Concentration refers to your ability to, once you got that information, right, to work with it, even in the most minimal manner, right? Can you take that information and uh, attend and work with it in some way, even in the most simplest of tasks? So with the waste, we're actually in the waste four. Some of the tests, as you may recall in our previous discussion, like digit span, right? Forward allows you to measure attention, whereas backwards, digit span backwards allows you to assess for concentration. Picture completion is also a good test of attention. Another test is the trail making test, okay? And how does the trail making test work? Well, it's kind of like connect the dots. Yeah, so here's a practice portion for the trail making test. And you literally just go from, you tell the examinee with their pencil to connect the dots in order from 1 to 2 to 3. And you tell them to go through the rest, right? Four, whoop, almost screwed that one up. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Right? Easy peasy. Then the actual test is this. Not so easy peasy. Alrighty. For anyone, it's a bit of work, but usually most people without brain pathology can usually do this in about 30, 45 seconds. But if someone's taking a few or several minutes, something's probably going on there. The other version is trail making test B. Okay. Now this is a whole lot of fun, where now they connect the dots, but not just sequentially by numerically, but also alphabetically, right? But they have to go in order from number to letter, from number to letter. So they have to alternate it. Yeah, making more of a test of concentration. Okay, so they go from 1A, 2B, and then in the practice session, you have them do the rest, right? The sample, 1A, 2B, whoop, almost screwed that one up again. 3C, 4D. All righty, and then here's the real one. Okay, but this test, right, trails A and B, very sensitive to attention and concentration abilities. Yeah, and with this, usually people can do this about 45-ish seconds. And then if someone's taking a few to several minutes, maybe something might be going on. Okay, so trail A, again, for visual scanning, writing speed, attention, and concentration. And I'm sorry, but trail B is not just for concentration, right? Trail A is also for attention and concentration. But trail B, what it tests for is switching sets. Yeah, so switching from one group of information, numbers, to, right, letters. Okay, so from going from numerically to alphabetically and being able to suspend that information, one group versus another, and then switching between the two. Okay, which certainly applies to a lot of daily tasks and routines. Okay. Now, in addition to ability, achievement, and so on, right? Someone could be having difficulties just with language use. Alrighty, and when thinking about language use, you want to think about expressive, right? Being able to talk, right? Write versus receptive, right? Being able to understand language information. And there are different tests that can measure each, right? And as an aside, someone can have problems in either or both, and to varying degrees. And that's really important for the clinician to understand, and for the patient, obviously, to understand. So in terms of tests of expressive speech, there's the Boston naming test, okay, which is simply a test where the examinee sees a number of pictures and they have to name the item. Alrighty. The other is a controlled word association test, which is kind of a fun test, almost a fun party game if you aren't being tested and you weren't in a psychologist's office. Basically, the test goes like this. The examinee is told that they're going to be told a letter and that they're supposed to come up with as many words as they can and they're timed within a specific time frame. Okay, so the letter might be B, so they might go bell, ball, beach, excuse me, and so on. Interesting enough, the number of words that are produced within a certain time frame is very indicative of expressive speech issues. Now, in terms of receptive, right, the ability to understand speech, the P-body is really good for that. You know, we saw the P-body earlier. The examiner says a word, and the person has to point to a picture that best captures that word, right? Kind of reverse of the Boston naming test. Now, for visual spatial perception, there are a number of tests that can tap into one's ability to deal with visual information and spatial information and work with that. Okay, certainly comes into play in many in our day-to-day lives, right? Working, dealing with things around the house, getting from one place to another, depending on our work, right? If we're in construction, engineer, whatever, we, you know, and even more verbally based fields like law or being, you know, being a psychologist, right? Writing reports, talking with people. I mean, there are bound to be tasks which are visually, spatially oriented. I mean, working with your computer is a visual spatial task. Yeah. So from the ways, again, should be four. Block design, object assembly, right? That puzzle task is very good for measuring visual spatial abilities. The Hooper visual organization test, which is basically what that is. It's reason why it's in parentheses in head is that it's basically a puzzle task, but instead of moving the puzzle pieces with your hand, the examinee is asked to look at the puzzle pieces and in their head try to like figure out what the puzzle is, what the completed puzzle object is. Yeah, so it's the idea of taking out the motoric component of the test. Yeah, so you don't have to use your hands, but you're just using your head. You're just visualizing it in your head. Okay. The Ray Osterreich complex figure test is this. The examinee is shown this picture for about, I think about 10 seconds if memory serves. And then they have to reproduce it as best as they can, right? Pretty complex task here, all right? Pretty challenging. And there are different points given for, if you remember, this cross, what I refer to as the bowling ball, how well you construct this. And for every little piece, there are points given. So it's a very sensitive test for visual spatial abilities. And finally, drawing a clock. Yeah, so you ask the person to draw a clock, and I think typically you ask them to draw the hands of the clock, indicating 10 to 11. Okay. Now, interesting enough, in this digital age that we live in, with our phones and so on, it might be much more difficult for people to do that than maybe, you know, 30 years ago when we were more analog kind of a society. But, you know, people still understand clocks in hands. So this is still a reasonable test to administer. Now, another neurovisual spatial neuropsych test, a classic in the field is the Bender Gestalt. Now, classic in the field certainly suggests some good aspects to it, right? It was very popularly used and so on. That said, the research supporting its use is weak, and most neuropsychologists don't use the Bender Gestalt. Okay? So why am I talking about it? Well, I'm talking about it because odds are you're going to run into this kind of data. Yeah, because some psychologists still like to use it. They don't use it as a neuropsych test per se, but they use it as kind of a rough kind of measure on whether, you know, something's going on in the head. If there's any, it's a very rough and crude kind of a dirty measure of whether there's some kind of brain pathology. Okay, and probably for that purpose, it's fair. Yeah, I would analogize the Bender Gestalt to the knee tapping test when you go for a physical exam with an MD, right? You all got that, right? Usually for your annual exam, they'll take out that little teeny weeny hammer and then they kind of tap your knee and then your leg always kind of moves up a bit, right? They tap it, whoop, your leg involuntarily demonstrates that reflex. Now, if you show that reflex, does that mean you're fine and you can go? No, that's not the case, right? Because it's a crude measure, right? It's just the physician is just seeing whether, you know, you have that reflex going on. Yeah. So just because your leg goes like this doesn't mean you're in great shape, right? You might have cancer, but at least you got the knee reflex going there. All righty. But if it doesn't move, it's like, uh-oh, that's not good. Yeah, that's not a good sign. Something's going on there. Okay? I would say the bend gestalt, you can analogize the bend gestalt to the knee tap test, right? If you see something, it's, concerning, there's probably something going on, but just because it's good doesn't mean there aren't brain problems. There are about 9 cards. The person, it's very simple. They just look at the card and copy it. And then after you go through all 9 cards, then you ask the examinee to draw as many as of the cards that they just saw as they can remember. Okay, so here are some of the cards. And these are some examples of how of poor responses of where something could be going on. Yeah, you can see how these are all important kind of distortions, okay, which are typically what you would see in someone suffering from some kind of brain problem. Here's card 1. Oh, by the way, this was card A. It was meant to be an experimental card, but ended up being so handy they kept it in the sequence of cards. Here's card 1, very simple, but you might get weird things like, open circles, not open circles, but circles as opposed to the dots here. Or something like this, where it looks like the letter M. Always looks to me like birds flying away. Card 2, 3, right? Very simple designs, which, if there's no brain pathology, if there's no brain, well, that most people can get. But even people with some brain pathology might be able to get this. But if you get real distortions, it tells you something's happening. Like here, yeah. You can tell, right? These curved lines look like 2 wave patterns, right? Crossing, but here it's like, ooh, kind of lost that wave design. Here we go. And here's another example of how things can get distorted. Now, as an aside, children will very often, reproduce the bending gestalt very poorly. And it's not because of brain pathology necessarily, but just generally most kids, like a 3 to 4-year-old or 5-year-old, they'll tend to do, their motor skills just aren't that great. Yeah. But if you see this in an adult, that might be a little more concerning. In a 3 to 4-year-old or 5-year-old, not uncommon to see distortions like that, because motor control develops over time. It takes some time before we start writing and drawing better. Alrighty, card 8. Now here are some of the distortions you may see, right? Like a rotation in the design, loss of angulation, right? In this card, it's like just kind of a scary eyeball staring at you. We got this, right? And they're not integrated, they're disintegrated. Perseverate. Now, perseveration is probably is a very common neurological symptom. Now, perseveration is a general kind of category. It refers to one continuing a certain type of response. Yeah. So someone might repeat a word several times. What's kind of concerning is that in perseveration, someone might do that and not notice that they're doing that. Yeah, or mind if it's brought to their attention. Right? Another version of it might be in writing behavior, right? So if you ask them to write something like this, they'll do some dots, but then go dot, 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 dot. And, in some really wild cases, they'll do it right off the paper, right onto the table. Okay, it's almost like well, back in the day, if you can imagine record players, it's like kind of like dust on the record, or if there's a scratch on the record, and then you get back in the day, what would happen is that particular specific point on the record, right? It would just repeat because of the dust or the distortion scratch on the record. Okay, and it's oddly enough, human beings, the brain, when there's a brain pathology, it manifests itself that way sometimes. Perseveration, classic neuropsych symptom, and doesn't happen all the time. But if you see it, odds are there's some kind of brain pathology. see some of the examples I just mentioned. Yeah, and the bender is very good at sniffing that out, so to speak, with its simple tasks. Here's another one, distortion of shape, disproportionate replications, right? Should be even, but it's like, ooh, very teeny compared to the size of the, I guess you could say, diamond. Okay, we'll get past personality interpretations based on Bender Gestalt responses. And I'm just going to bypass this because the empirical support for this is really weak. So here's a bender that was done by a patient. And you can see it often will take someone, they can go through this in about a few minutes. This person took a little more than a few minutes. Some of these look fine, like that, right? Look like decent replications. You see, ooh, something's going on here, and maybe something here, and certainly something here. Yeah, and we can see the disintegration here. Yeah. So if you just gave a few of these cards, you might not notice it, but if you give a few more, you notice something kind of maybe happening. Here's another one. Oof, really, you can see this bender looks really not good, right? Good example, perseveration here. Not perseveration here, but certainly with this one. Clear sign of disintegration. That's a little odd. Wow, this one it just totally lost the overall sense of what this illustration was, right? It's probably the two cross waves here. And it took the person about 10 minutes to do this, right? Most people, it just takes about a few minutes. They can go through it very quickly if there's absolutely nothing going on. Here's others, right? And they don't, and you can see the psychologist did a smart thing. What he did was they did a quick sketch of what the drawing was supposed to be, or what was presented, and then what was the response. Yeah, this one they seem to get, but it was obviously it's a distortion. For number three, I think what they're saying is number three became I'm sorry, oops, number three became that. And I think what they're saying is that a lot of these, I think five was supposed to be card five. Let me just go back here a bit. Sorry. Yeah, so card five is that. And yep, so sorry about that. Card five is here, but then it got kind of distorted. I think that became that, and so on. Yeah, that became that. I think that's what's being illustrated. Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. The six became that, and five, I think maybe that wasn't a problem, and seven became that. Yeah, so and this became that. Looks like it became a cigarette or something. Yeah, so you can see clear problem there. Here's an example of one that was perfect. Took the person 12 minutes, but you can see, wow, they almost literally reproduced it. So no apparent problem here, at least based on the Gestalt. But again, it's a rough, crude measure. It doesn't mean that there aren't any problems. But at least you go, ooh, okay, at least so far that knee certainly went up all right. Took them a long time, but you can see, well, it was worth the effort because it came out quite perfectly. Okay. As you can surmise, the person who did this was an engineer. Okay, there are also now probably the most common referral question in neuropsych testing are memory problems. And I may have mentioned this before in a prior class, prior lecture, probably on the one on the waist. But memory problems are very often the reason why people bring themselves to their general practitioner, neurologist, or even a psychologist initially. Because that's something people are kind of sensitive to. Yeah, when their friends are saying, hey, don't you recall? Or friends and family or at work, they're forgetting things. So that's a very common reason why people bring themselves in to a physician or psychologist. Okay, probably the most common one. And because people don't tend to catch attentional, concentration, organizational planning all those other kinds of potential problems nearly as much, or they work around it. But memory is just something maybe people are more sensitive to, have a harder time working around, so they bring themselves in more commonly um, for um, for consultation. Okay. Now, tests that are very good at measuring, there are a number of verbal tests on the Whimsy. Yeah, you may recall our talking about that test. Yeah, and there are also, and Whimsy is also good for tapping, for measuring nonverbal memory functions. Now, aside from all the other cognitive functions, motor functioning, yeah, is a cognitive function. Being able to coordinate one's movement, which may be critical to things that we do every day, like driving, and for many other people, right, work-related tasks, right? It can really vary, and some occupations require a lot of very attuned motor functioning. Yeah, maybe moving vehicles or large objects, and so on. Okay. There are a number of tests that measure motor functioning quite well. Trail making, some of the WACE subtests, WACE 4, the finger tapping test. Now, the finger tapping test, which we mentioned before when we were talking about the batteries, is a very simple test. Yeah, all you have is a device, which is about maybe 6 inches in length, 2 inches in height, and it looks like a seesaw, and well, it can look like a seesaw, but it just basically looks like a Morse code tapping device. Yeah, but here the person uses their finger, typically their forefinger, in tapping this kind of little switch, and they have to tap it as quickly as they can. And I think they have 3 trials, and of about 45 to 60 seconds. And then what's counted are the number of taps within each trial. They do that for the right one hand, and then they do it for the other hand, right and left hand. Alrighty. And interesting enough, that very simple task, very sensitive to possible motor functioning problems. The other is the grooved pegboard, which we got illustrated here. Okay, so what you got, this is actually a tiny version of it. This might be about 8 inches and about maybe 4 inches across, maybe more like 10 and 6, sorry. And you have a bunch of holes, pukas, with little grooves in them. You can hardly see, but they're going in different directions here. Okay. Then you got in this little hole here above a bunch of little metal spikes with grooves in them. So the examinee's task, they first do it with one hand alone, and then with not 2 hands at the same time, but one hand alone. And then they are timed for inserting the pigs into the grooves. Okay, and they do it as many as they can within a certain time frame. Again, if memory serves, it's like about 45, 60 seconds. They do it with one hand, and they do it then with the right hand. And I think they also do it at, there's another trial where they do it with both hands. So this is one form, kind of a tiny, small version. This is a larger version of that. This is more like about 1.5 feet, excuse me, about 1.5 feet, I don't know, about 1 foot in width. And they do it down one column with the left, and then one with the right hand, and then I think they do both. Very similarly, a grooved pegboard. Okay. Interesting enough, this test was initially developed in order to test factory workers and their ability to, guess what, put pegs into grooves. But then it was discovered it's not just a good task to see how fast someone can put little pegs into grooves in factories, but then it actually was sensitive for picking up brain problems. And the other is the dynamometer. The dynamometer is here. Basically, it's a hand grip test, right? So it's about the size of your hand, right? And you can pull on this, and this measures the weight in kilograms that you can compress the lever here. You do it, I think, a couple trials with one hand and then the other. And again, it's a great measure of motor functioning, gross motor functioning, obviously. And then you can determine which side of the brain there may be some brain pathology. All right, and finally, there are a couple tests to measure executive functions. Yeah. As you may recall from other classes, executive functions refer maybe learning cognition, maybe intrasight. Executive functions deal with frontal lobe brain functions, yeah, which and they specifically relate to things like being able to organize, plan, right, understand a sequence of events, like logically reason, all that kind of stuff. Now, two common tests which measure this include the Wisconsin card sorting test and the Stroop effect. Now, what we see here is an illustration of the Wisconsin card sorting test. Now, it looks like a fun kids game. Not so fun when you're being examined. Basically, you have as examiner, you're holding a deck of cards, and they all vary in either shape, right, triangle, square, circle, or cross, color, red, green, and so on, and number, 2, 3, 4, 1, what have you. Okay. Now, what you do is you lay down the cards one by one, right? And you lay it in a specific order. So the R cards are in a specific sequence, right? So it's a deck of cards in a specific sequence, and you lay down the cards in that sequence. Now, when you lay down a card, the examinee, his or her task is to determine whether the code, yeah, it's like breaking a code. So the code is either color, shape, or number. And they have to tell you whether the code, now you know what the code is based on a, again, standardized sequence of codes, whether the code is based on number, color, or shape. Yeah. Now, if they guess the code correctly, right, you tell them correct. If they don't, you say wrong. Okay. So let's just say the code is 4, right? And the examinees guess, they know it's either color, shape, or number. They first say red, and you go wrong. You lay down this, all right? And then they go, is it circle? And you go, no, it isn't circle. And then you lay down this card, and then they might figure, oh, the code is number 4, and then they go number, and then you go yes, and then you lay down another card, and they go number, and then once they get that, you just reinforce them for every time they figured it, and you lay down the card. Okay, they figured out the code. Now, the thing that can happen, right, and the examinee is told this, is that the code will change at some point, either to, well, if it's number at one point, it'll change to shape or color, right? So if they're saying you go correct, you lay down a card, you go number, correct, number, correct. Now, then it may switch to, it was changed to, let's see, now I'm trying to remember the way this example could go. It can change to the number from 4 to 2, right? So they go, so you lay down this and you go, and they go 4, right? And I'm sorry, previously they were saying 4, and you go no, and they go 3, and they guess 4 again, and then you go no, and then you lay this down, and they go, okay, what is it? Is it shape? Yeah, and you go no, and then you lay down this one, and then they go, oh, is it the number 2? And you go correct, and then you lay down this and you go correct. All righty. Sorry about that, my little haphazard explanation of how the code changes. But just keep in mind, the important thing is you lay down the cards, they have to guess which of the 3 parameters is code, and they also know, and then you reinforce them. If they get it wrong, so the whole point is to guess, right? And when you're guessing, right, you're using information you were previously provided, right? That the code will be either shape, color, or number, and you're guessing at it, right, involves you doing a number of things, right? Remembering what was, well, you don't even have to remember, it's laid down. So looking at what was laid down, figuring out the pattern, and then trying to determine, all right, what should I do next, right? Should I say it's numbers? Should I say it's shape? Should I say it's color? Alrighty, so that tests into your ability to take in information and to plan accordingly and then act accordingly to say what the code is. Okay, the other is the Stroop effect. Now, the Stroop effect, you may have learned about this in learning and cognition, is a very simple but very sensitive test of frontal lobe functioning or executive functioning. Okay. In the first task, you're given a list of words and you're asked to read the list of words as quickly as you can. Alrighty, so here's the list. You just go down red, green, blue, and so on. Alrighty, and then the examiner tallies how many of the words you got within the time frame. The next task is to indicate, and I'm sorry, this is kind of a bad copy of it, but then you're given a list of colors, okay? You're given a list of color stimuli, and you're supposed to name the colors in order, just like you did with the words. So here you go blue, red, green, this is supposed to be green, blue, green, red, green, and so on as quickly as you can. And again, the number of stimuli that you identify correctly is tallied. Then here's the task that kind of makes people go, ugh. Okay, your task is to read the word, identify the color that's written, but not the color of the text. In other words, what's written here is red, so you would say red. What's written here is green, the word green, so you'd say green. So you wouldn't say the color blue of the text, of the print, but you'd say the color that's indicated in the word. Alrighty? So you can see what you're doing. What that kind of forces your brain to do is to kind of handle two sources of information, right? So you're having the information, the visual information of the color, right? And you're also getting the information of the word in the text, right? And you're supposed to also keep in mind that what you're supposed to answer is the word in the text, right? So you're getting two incoming sources of information, but then you're supposed to just respond to one of them, alrighty? Which again is very sensitive to executive functioning, goes to your ability to organize complex stimuli in the environment and then to respond accordingly. Alrighty, another part of neuropsych testing, which people don't normally associate with and people, including psychologists, don't associate with neuropsych testing, is personality testing. Okay, very commonly, and when personality testing is done by neuropsychologists, they use objective tests. They won't use projective tests, which we'll discuss in a later chapter. Okay, the most common one that they use is the one that's used most in the world, which is the MMPI. And personality testing is done for a number of reasons. Well, a big one is for differential diagnosis, as mentioned previously. Yeah. So is someone's planning organizational ability due to brain pathology, or is it due to personality functioning? Yeah. And sometimes the two are hard to discern. Yeah, both may be occurring at the same time. Yeah, or does someone have a long-standing personality difficulty, which leads to their being emotionally labile, right? And they've been this way for decades. Yeah. Then had a car accident, and now they're having difficulty with planning or organizing. Yeah. And sometimes a personality test, that kind of data can help you kind of sort out which whether the organization, planning, attention concentration difficulties are a function of the car accident, or to what extent it's a function of long-standing personality profile. Okay. Sometimes the data is also used to kind of sniff out the validity of the patient's report. Yeah, sniff out meaning whether the person is being forthcoming with the data that they're presenting, or in other words, whether you suspect malingering. Okay. Now, the MMPI isn't a malingering test per se, but what the test data can tell you, provide evidence of, is whether what the person is presenting is valid or not. Yeah. And then that goes to the question, the larger question of malingering. Yeah. And in order to make that determination, you need other points of data and so on. Alrighty. But certainly it is a very common, the MMPI is a very common instrument that's used to help support an examiner's determination of whether malingering is going on. Yeah, in other words, is someone presenting psychological symptoms for some external gain, like money or to get out of jail or something. Okay, can kind of bypass this. Um, there are also tests of to determine the client's effort that they're putting into the testing. Yeah, so scores may be a function of brain pathology. It may be a function of how much effort they're putting into the testing that day. Yeah, the MMPI is kind of good for assessing that. And this again kind of goes back to the question of what is their motivation. Yeah. So what's going on here? There's the F scale, which measures to what extent the person may be presenting themselves in a bad light, right? That they're sick, or the extent to which the person is trying to present themselves in a good light, and that's what the L scale will measure. Okay, um, but just want to really be clear here. Although the MMPI is frequently included in neuropsych testing, yeah, it's not a neurocognitive. It's not designed to be a test of neurocognitive function. Right? It's designed to be a measure of personality functioning. Right. So what you're using the MMPI for is to determine how the personality functioning may be affecting the neuropsych functioning or the neuropsych data. Okay. Effort and motivation is also determined statistically on all the other neurological tests, neuropsychological tests. Yeah. If the person is performing poorly, but it's below chance, yeah, below what even how someone would perform if they just responded randomly or by a flip of a coin. If it's below chance, and you see this on a number of tests, that might indicate to you that if someone is performing so poorly that it's even below how anyone would just answer if they were just randomly answering, yeah, it might be evidence towards the hypothesis that the person is faking bad. Yeah. You also want to look at the accuracy, how they're doing on easy and hard items. Yeah. Someone suffering from real brain pathology will do clearly better on easy items than on more difficult items. Yeah. But if someone is doing poorly on easy items and hard items, again, it may be evidence. It may be evidence that they're suffering from such severe pathology. But odds are that even in most cases where people are suffering from severe brain damage, they tend to do well on some items than others, right? It's usually most brain pathology. You don't have everyone, just bottoming out on everything. People tend to show patterns of brain functioning. But if you see someone bottoming out on everything, on easy and hard items, it may be evidence of malingering. And finally, a neuropsychological assessment and examination may actually involve a physical component. Yeah. Now, I want to make it clear, neuropsychologists shouldn't be asking someone to disrobe for neuropsych testing. Something's going on if your psychologist is asking you to disrobe. Alrighty, but there are certainly uh, a time and place for a physical examination. Alrighty, here we're talking about much less invasive kinds of physical interventions. Okay, first of all, neuropsychologists may take into account your appearance. Yeah, does it seem as though you're disheveled, or are you well groomed? That might say something about your planning, impulse control, how you're groomed. Yeah, if it looks like half your face is shaved better than another, that may say something about motor functioning or visual spatial functioning. Now, another thing that a neuropsychologist may do is that they might do a very quick, gentle examination by touching one's scalp or skull. Okay, they certainly would ask the examinee if they would. Well, first of all, you always ask for consent with any testing, which we'll get into later. But certainly for this component, you'd probably want to remind and ask again get the client's consent to touch their scalp or skull. Okay, the neuropsychologist, even though they're not a physician, probably would put on some latex gloves, just gently touch and on top and around the skull area. Now, why would they do that? Yeah. What they would be looking for is any evidence of brain injury. Okay. Now, why wouldn't they just rely on an individual's report? Well, a number of reasons. One, the person may suffer from amnesia. Another may be the person just plain forgot. Alrighty. Another thing is that someone might remember hitting their head, but it may not occur to them to report that as a head injury. Right? Maybe they, as a child, right? They suffer some playground injury at the seesaw or something, and they just it's minor. It wasn't like a car accident or something, but when the examiner touches their head, they find a slight indentation. And then the person goes, "Oh yeah, that was that seesaw accident." But it didn't occur to me to mention that. That was just a little ding that I experienced. Well, maybe it wasn't that little ding if the examiner was finding a slight indentation at the back of the head or left or right temporal lobes. Another thing that the examiner may do is touch the forearms. Yeah, usually not the upper legs, upper thighs or upper legs, but usually maybe the arms. Yeah, to see if there's any muscular development differential between the left and right arms. Yeah, again, that might suggest that the person is using one side of their body more than the other. Yeah, which may, and sometimes people don't even realize they do that, right? Because maybe for years they're compensating for some discoordination, which may be a function of brain damage, but they end up using their left or right arm more to balance, to grab things. So that's one thing you might want to notice. That there seems to be a kind of a gross imbalance in terms of the size of the upper of the arm muscles. Another one will be simple reflexes. Yeah, and so one that's very simple, but it's an important one. And oddly enough, this can be a really good sign in brain pathology. Is you have the person stand and then with their feet together and then close their eyes. Now, just like with the knee tap, just because if you don't see anything doesn't mean there isn't a brain problem. But one thing that sometimes shows in people suffering from brain pathology is that if you ask them to stand and ask them to stand still with their eyes closed, they can't. Yeah, what happens is that they start wavering left and right. And this is where the psychologist kind of should stand behind the person or near them so that they can catch them in case it gets real bad, right? You don't know how much someone might waver. You don't need the person to fall and hurt themselves. Okay. Another is muscle coordination. Okay. So a very simple one. And now no more touching is involved, but here the psychologist may ask the person to look at to watch me, the examiner. I'm going to go 1, 3, 2, 4, 3, 5, 1, 3, 2, 4, 3, 5, like a piano. And can you do that? And some people can, and if they can't, it may be a sign of some kind of problem. Okay, so some of these physical tasks may be signs of something. Alrighty, you might want to do this to a friend or someone on a blind date. See if there's anything going on before you date them further. But here are, don't do that. And don't play a neuropsychologist and tell them they got brain damage if you see something weird. But if you do see some of these things, you might tell them, hey, maybe you ought to go see somebody. That's kind of weird. Alrighty, and finally, what is part and parcel of a neuropsych assessment will be collecting supplementary information. And that supplementary information, which may make a world of difference in terms of how you interpret scores, include getting a medical history, psychiatric history, including treatment, medications, so on, psychosocial history, yeah, especially education. Yeah, was there a stark change in school performance in what areas and so on? Yeah, collateral information made by interviewing spouse, partner, romantic partner, friends, family members, and so on. Yeah, when relevant and with obviously with the examinee's consent, work, co-workers, supervisor, and so on. And just other behavioral observations that the neuropsychologist may make, not besides all the ones that I just mentioned in the examination room, also just watching in the waiting room. Yeah, watching them here, and this goes back to the physical exam. One very common task that a neuropsychologist may do is ask someone to walk down the hallway outside the office. Yeah, and what you might want to do is watch their gait or their manner of walking. Yeah, that's another thing that the body's very sensitive to. Is if there's brain pathology, one way it may show itself is in some kind of abnormality in how they walk. Yeah, so you might see them leaning towards a certain direction or leaning on one foot versus another. You might see them stumbling a little bit. That may be a clear sign, yeah, of some kind of brain pathology, which may be hard to see in the waiting room or in the examination room. Okay, and with that, that's all I have to say about neuropsych testing. Alrighty, and with that, we'll chat about this chapter further when we meet face to face. But with that, that ends chapter 10. And thank you for your attention, and I'll see you later. Take care. Bye bye.